welcome to our Careers in Peacebuilding Talk Story series. My name is José Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for Peace here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Our talk story today will focus on Forgiving the Unforgivable, Sakura Pearls, Healing from World War II with Director G.K. Hunter and Professor Brien Hallett. Thank you for joining us today to learn about journeying to the profession. Today on Veterans Day, we will have a conversation with Director G.K. Hunter, who will discuss his latest documentary, Sakura Pearls, Healing from World War II. That is a cutting-edge PBS documentary about a special meeting between Japanese survivors of the atomic bomb and the US survivors of Pearl Harbor. This remarkable and intense exchange between former enemies, sparkling dialogue about how we can resolve conflict without repeating the painful experiences of our ancestor. Also joining with us is Professor Hallett. So we are very honored to have Professor Hallett, who is not only a veteran Marine from Vietnam and also the current director of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace. And a little bit further knowledge about our great speakers today. G.K. Hunter is a writer-director of Sakura Pearls, who shares inspiring stories of forgiveness to show the future generations that we can mend the scars of history. He began his career as a facilitator of multicultural workshops, helping such groups as Jewish Holocaust survivors and Native American veterans find healing from their past. He's also the author of Healing Our Bloodlines, the 8 Realizations of Generational Liberation, which is a guidebook that teaches us how our families can heal after devastation of war. G.K. Hunter has spoken at such venues as Cornell University, NPR's All Things Considered, and the Pacific Historic Parks History Talk series. Professor Brien Hallett also fought as a Marine in Vietnam. He thought that there were many constitutional and ethical problems, particularly with the decision-making that led to the war. These problems reappear in most other wars. Since then, Professor Hallett has devoted his efforts to understanding what these issues are and how to ameliorate them. He has concluded that the incapacity of the Congress to quote-unquote declare war is the principal constitutional issue, that John Austin's theory of performative speech acts lead to proper correction of both the constitutional and ethical issues that surround decisions to go to war. In coming to these conclusions, his teachings about the Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and others they didn't thought has been central to deep understanding of war, peace, and the ethics that govern both. And thank you again, both of you, for joining us today. And to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to G.K. Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you, Brien Hallett, for joining me today. Today, I'm speaking as a civilian who deeply cares about the affairs of veterans and looks at wars as opportunities for healing. And Brien Hallett today will be speaking from a veteran perspective, as well as one of the premier historians around what happened in World War II, specifically in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay, so when it comes to peacemaking and peace building, we're always looking for those really rare moments where reconciliation happens. And they often happen in events that have been labeled unforgivable. If we look at World War II, there's many of these deeply painful events that have happened. And so I'm always looking for those rare opportunities to find former enemies that come together in a spirit of reconciliation and essentially forgiving what was previously labeled as unforgivable, which as a result challenges us to redefine what is forgivable and how to heal from the past, especially between two different cultures. I'd like to just take a moment to dedicate today's talk to Everett Highland and James Lee, who we affectionately called Jimmy Lee. Everett Highland, for over 25 years, was a Pearl Harbor Visitor Center volunteer educator. He's a Pearl Harbor survivor. He survived on the USS Pennsylvania, and he is one of the most remarkable veterans I've personally ever met. And we also have James Lee, who I affectionately call Uncle Jimmy. Jimmy Lee has also served as a Pearl Harbor Visitor Center educator, and he's a child survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack. He grew up right on the shores of Pearl Harbor, and he was 11 years old when the Zeros were flying over his head. Just two remarkable gentlemen and veterans worth honoring. I would also like to say the reason that I'm dedicating this talk to these two gentlemen isn't just because that they were crucial elders featured in the PBS special Sakura and Pearls, Healing from World War II. But while I was making the movie, and this picture right here is them at the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center, I had this feeling of, in my gut, of anxiety, like I had to hurry up and capture their stories and their testament to the world. And I'm so glad I listened to that, gut instinct that told me to arrange this sooner rather than later. We filmed the special meeting at the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center in April of 2019. And by July, unfortunately, Uncle Everett Highland passed away. So in this PBS special is Uncle Everett's last testament to the world about what he went through and his philosophy about Pearl Harbor. Likewise, Uncle Jimmy Lee, the December of that same year, also passed away. So I'm eternally grateful to both of them. They deserve the dedication and acknowledgement that I had a chance to interview them, and I feel a sense of responsibility to share their last testament with the future generations. We all have a lot to learn from them, in my opinion. Sakura and Pearls, Healing from World War II. It asked former enemies to meet face-to-face. Atomic bomb survivors from Hiroshima flew out to Pearl Harbor, to the visitor center, to meet Uncle Jimmy and Uncle Everett, two Pearl Harbor survivors. They were former enemies that met face-to-face. We exclusively captured this meeting for PBS, and it is now, you are able to stream it live on PBS now on demand. And if you're interested in doing that, the easiest way to do that is just to go to my website, gkhunter.com, and you'll see it right there. It says stream PBS. There's several options to do so. I'd like to share with you the PBS teaser right now so you can have a sense of what the movie is about.
A flash of light, a wall of fire, destroyed a city.
I wished you never ever dropped the ball.
I wrote down later, my God, what have we done?
All of us can feel hate. But once we realize that hate, holding on to it becomes a choice.
If I hate, I should hate war.
So again, that is available to be seen right now, and it will be for the rest of the year. And really, it's a very hopeful movie, although at times very emotional. I'll be honest with you. To be transparent, there's a few times that I cried on my keyboard while I was actually making this movie. I'm not ashamed to admit it because it's deeply touching. But it's also very hopeful and at times, believe it or not, funny. The natural humor that comes from these really tense moments. Our elders really have a keen sensibility, but there's a couple of funny moments that were very uplifting and I think very hopeful to see four brave elders who used to be enemies from different cultures coming together and embracing by the end of the film is worth seeing. A couple quick thank yous here. I want to thank you, send a thank you out to Shigeaki Mori-san, Koko Kando-san, Masahiro Sasaki-san, Yamawaki-san. These are all hibakusha, meaning atomic bomb survivors that contributed to the movie. Suzanne Vidala and Erin Saito were crucial behind the scenes, getting everything together. The Pacific Historic Parks, Pearl Harbor Visitor Center, where the meeting took place, the Nagasaki Peace Memorial Hall, Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, Matsunaga Charitable Foundation, Sadako Peace Crane Foundation, which is in association with the Punahou School, Ralph Edwards Production, Seeds of Peace, and Leeward Community College, which helped me to learn how to make movies. I went back to school for that. Last but not least, the UH Matsunaga Institute for Peace, including my fellow speaker, the Director Brien Hallett, Maya Satora Ing, Kerry Yurisevic, and also José Barzola. I'm sure you've seen a smiling face many times before. He's the guy behind the scenes who's connecting people all the time. So I appreciate you, Jose. Thank you. So why World War II? For the past 20 years, I've been studying World War II because I believe that it holds the secrets to healing any atrocity that humanity has been through. Think about it. Big historic events leave huge collective wounds, and these collective wounds often take generations to heal. From the horrors of the Holocaust to the shock of the Pearl Harbor attack, the shattering impact of the Battle of Midway, to the devastation of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of these events, in one way or another, have been deemed so deep, so painful, that they could be seen as almost being unforgivable, especially if you're a person who went through this. But as a peacemaker and someone who believes peace building can prevent war, I'm constantly looking for opportunities to find people that have gone through devastating events and yet had come out on the other side finding some kind of reconciliation, some kind of forgiveness. So it asks the questions, what happens when we forgive what was previously thought to be unforgivable? Those are the moments that I look for. And I see that World War II being like a stress test for humanity, because it's the first war where we use nuclear power. And it was the war that definitively showed humanity that we possess the power to destroy ourselves. I got my start working with Jewish Holocaust survivors as a healer and group facilitator. And here you can see on this slide, I'm at a talk with a very special man named Michael Berenbaum. And this talk was called Healing the Holocaust. And this was done at the Los Angeles Museum for the Holocaust. For those who don't know, Michael Berenbaum is very important for two major jobs that he did. The first one is he was the director of the Washington, D.C. Holocaust Museum, which is the biggest Holocaust museum in the US. And he was also the CEO for Steven Spielberg's The Shoah Foundation. Shoah is the Hebrew word for the Holocaust. And the purpose of the Shoah Foundation was to take the proceeds that Spielberg made from Schindler's List and to use that to document the video testimonies of Jewish Holocaust survivors so that an archive was built up for the sake of history. Well, that inspired me to want to do that with atomic bomb survivors and later US Pearl Harbor survivors. So it was really an honor to give this talk with Michael. He's still a source of inspiration for me today. And the work that I started off doing eventually became a system of healing. It's generational healing work that we call bloodline healing. And this started first with the families that survived the Holocaust, but it was later adapted so that we had multicultural workshops and people would come, they would bring their family tree, and they would discover what we call invisible burdens. These are the unresolved emotions left over from wars and from travesties, the things that we carry. And the future generations can inherit these feelings, even if they didn't necessarily go through them themselves, because they were raised with their parents or grandparents who went through it themselves. And in that work, we broke it down into 8 realizations that the Holocaust survivors helped to reveal to us that people had. The 8th one, the 8th step, is that forgiveness makes shared peace possible. Meaning forgiveness is a necessary step in order to truly have sustainable peace. I'm going to go a little bit more into that in a bit. PBS, this documentary, Sakura Pearls, Healing from World War II, was the first time that this work was captured on camera. And here's the book, Healing Our Bloodline, 8 Realizations of Generational Liberation. It's written for people of all backgrounds, all histories, to identify any invisible burdens you might be carrying from big historic events. And it shows you how you can cleanse these invisible burdens and claim the life that you truly want to live. If you're interested in that, my website is gkhunter.com. You can find out, it's on Amazon now. So I've used this word forgiveness for a few times, and I don't want to assume that everybody has the same definition for the word. So for the purposes of generational healing, I define forgiveness as giving up the wound. That is to say, when somebody wounds us in a big historic event, inside that wound is pain. And if we hold on to that pain, then by this definition, forgiveness has not happened. Forgiveness is when we have processed the wound enough that we can surrender the pain, we can give it up. The word give is in forgiveness. We give up the pain, we give up the expectation and demand that the other person is held accountable for that pain. And the gift to us is that we reclaim that part of our heart that was used to hold that heavy emotion, that frees it up to love your kids and to hug and to enjoy, to breathe the free air. And so we're looking for forgiveness to help us to see if the healing process has happened. When I was making Sakura and Pearls, I wanted to know from the survivors if they had forgiven each other. And so that's what I did. I asked every survivor, whether they were an atomic bomb survivor or a US Pearl Harbor survivor, I asked them, do you forgive the other side for how they hurt you? The very people that put you in a place of survival, where you had to survive something that is something we will never know. Do you forgive them? How do we get forgiveness to happen? Well, after working with survivors of the Holocaust and the attack on Pearl Harbor and the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a process of healing emerged for the generational healing process. I call these the 4 virtues of healing. They are empathy, which leads to trust, which inspires forgiveness, which breeds hope. Empathy is the ability to feel what somebody else is feeling, to acknowledge their sacrifice or what they've been through in a way that's heart-centered, in a way that's feeling. Trust is being able to trust somebody, getting to know them enough that you can trust them again. If they've hurt you, it's retrusting them, rebuilding that trust. Forgiveness, as we've already said, is giving up the pain, no longer claiming demands or rights over that pain. And hope is that feeling that I hope the future generations have, where it is possible to work together again. And now more than ever, we need that hope as we tackle the climate crisis and as we peace build to try to prevent another global conflict in the Pacific Rim specifically, which has been in the news a lot lately. So let's turn to our 2 veterans, our 2 teachers for the evening, Everett Highland and Jimmy Lee. Both of them offer us 2 lessons in empathy. Now, as you remember from the last slide, empathy is the way healing starts. It sparks our hearts to heal. That's what empathy does. Another way to say that is you truly listen to someone in an empathic way. And Everett and Jimmy both have 2 different lessons that they're going to share with us tonight. I also have some clips from the movie so you can see the moments of breakthrough as we caught them on camera. So I'm going to share some of them with you today. Let's start with Everett Highland. And his lesson is acknowledging sacrifice. I have a profound admiration for Everett, and I'm honored that I got to be with him at his 96th birthday, which both at the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center and the restaurant afterwards. It was really one of the great honors of my life. I know that a lot of people are like, oh, I want to meet that celebrity or that singer or that comedian or, you know, whatever. For me, I would rather meet these heroes as I see it, the people who have been through some of the worst events and come out just exemplary human beings. The thing I admire most about Everett is that even when he was surviving the attack on Pearl Harbor on the USS Pennsylvania, he still had empathy for his Japanese counterparts.
Oh.
I remember asking him, do you forgive the Japanese? And he said, you know, there's nothing to forgive because I was in the same situation as they were. You know, they were guys, soldiers doing their job, and I was a soldier doing my job. I was a sailor doing my job. And he really saw it that way. And later on, his wife turned out to be from Japan. So I remember one line from the movie, he's talking about Tom Brokaw, and he's doing an interview with him. And he asked him, do you have any animosity towards the Japanese? And he turned to Tom and he said, my wife is from Japan. And Tom said, well, I guess that answers that question. I'd like to share a clip with you right now. As a civilian, I think it's important to acknowledge the sacrifice of veterans. And so right now I'm going to share Everett talking at the meeting that we had at the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center about what he survived.
Some officer spotted me. I could hear him say, get that man to sick bay. Twice I've had physicians come up to me and they had heard me speak in the theater, and they told me they were doctors and they were curious about what kind of injuries I had to put me in the hospital for 9 months. I tell them I had my right ankle ripped open. I had a piece of bone out of the right leg. I had a bullet through the right thigh. My right hand was ripped open. I had 5 pieces of shrapnel in the left leg. Had a large piece taken out of my left thigh. I lost part of my left elbow and part of my left bicep. And both of them said, you should be dead. Well, almost.
You know, that's just a little bit more of Everett's sense of humor there. Just a cheerful guy. He's been through it all. And as you can see, being in a hospital for 9 months, being touch and go, having skin grafts and all of these painful surgeries, and yet he still had empathy for his counterparts. He even said at one time, you know, if I disobeyed an order as a US sailor, I'd get in trouble, I'd be court-martialed, and, you know, there'd be a lot of shame involved, but I wouldn't be killed. And he said, my counterparts, if they disobeyed an order, they were killed. And so for someone who had gone through that, to have empathy is just, it still stuns me today, just the quality of man that he was. And he had a wonderful sense of humor, and you get to see that in the movie as well. So I encourage you to learn a little bit more about Everett through the movie. Now let's talk about Jimmy Lee. Jimmy was only 11 years old, and you can see this little picture of him with his dog there, cute as can be. He grew up on the shores of Pearl Harbor, and one Sunday, all of a sudden, these planes start going overhead, and he hears about the explosions. And so it's not the first time that they had, you know, exercises, military exercises there, but there was something different about this. And at first he thought it was a show. And the thing I admire most about Uncle Jimmy was that he told it like it is. And he spent a lot of his time working with the younger generations, going to schools. When we had programs, the Matsunaga Institute brings a lot of people from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center. 9 times out of 10, he was the guy talking to these kids. And when we asked him challenging questions, he didn't back down from the challenge. He always gave us some kind of answer. He dug in and he gave us an answer. And so in a minute, I'm going to share how I challenged him in an interview and just an amazing lesson he taught me about surrendering rhetoric. That empathy can happen when you surrender your rhetoric. Rhetoric is usually some kind of persuasive message that's said over and over and over again to try to persuade the public to, a certain perspective. In World War I, it was the war to end all wars. Spoiler alert, there was a part 2, and we're talking about it today. So that's an example of rhetoric where it's very convincing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be true, where it's something that we need to challenge to see where the truth lies. So here, I would like to just share, and I should share with people that this movie does have funny parts, it does have hopeful parts, but it also has emotional parts, and this is one of them. Different than what you normally see, where you have a narrator telling you what happens and then you see the old footage, we did it differently. Jimmy told us about the Pearl Harbor attack that he as a child witnessed on the shores of Pearl Harbor as the Zeros were passing right over his head. And then we brought the historic footage and embedded it as he was telling the story. And this is just a quick clip from the movie talking about the attack on Pearl Harbor and the emotional impact it had on him.
Back at the meeting, Jimmy Lee tells us about the day he survived the attack on Pearl Harbor.
I was born and raised on a farm, out near Pearl City area. And my job, even though I was an 11-year-old kid at that time, was to feed the animals, to feed the pigs. And mind you, on that Sunday morning, I was feeding the pig. And suddenly overhead, wow, right at treetop level, the planes came down. I could see it. I could hear the machine gun fire, the explosion, and the roll of the plane. Looking up, wow, the red circle. And I could even see the pilot. Where I sat on the other side of the island, I didn't know what ship what they were in. But here comes the dive bombers, then the explosion and fire. I picture myself going out on the boat here now. And right by the bridge over here, there was a battleship. Of course, I didn't know what it was. That was the Nevada, I found out later. It was being bombarded, burning and smoking, been bombarded right out in front of me, about half a mile from my home. But at that time, there were a lot of ships out there. But I see the name, it's empty now. I picture the ships burning and smoking. Hey, we come to the Missouri. I look at the Missouri. Hey, that's a battleship. If you take a look at a battleship, that's what it looks like. But I never saw a battleship like that. I saw a battleship upside down, bottoms up. Not too many people see something like that. I didn't know at that time, but that was Oklahoma, out there over there. But that's when I first saw a battleship like that. And when I looked at the Missouri, I said, that's exactly where the Oklahoma was. And then when that boat turns around, I look up in the sky over on the Hickory side, and I see torpedo planes all coming in, dropping the torpedoes, some of them hitting targets and everything else. As we move back up towards the Arizona, and I look at the Arizona, I said, wow, I heard the explosion. I saw all the flames. I look, I don't see the monument. You know what I see? I see small boats going around. I thought they were picking up debris, but what were they doing? Plucking up dead bodies and survivors for the burning one. Man, that's an awful sight to see. That's what I see. I don't see the monument. That's what I see because that's what I remember. And then finally, it was over. And when we came back home, it was nothing but smoke and fire.
By 9:45 a.m., the attack on Pearl Harbor was over. The attack lasted 1 hour and 50 minutes before the Japanese retreated.
Ran out of fuel.
Yeah. So as you can see there, it's very intense and emotional, but also very important to see what an 11-year-old child went through. And this event actually inspired Jimmy to become part of the Army, and he's a Vietnam War veteran. And so, you know, as you can see here, this is obviously a deep impact to have on someone who's 11 years old. So, you know, he did grow up with a sense of the atomic bombs ended the war in the same way that World War I had the rhetoric, this is the war to end all wars. There is a repetitive message in World War II that the atomic bombs were necessary to end World War II. In a little bit, we're going to have our resident expert, Brien Hallett, who gave us a great interview for the movie to talk a little bit more about the details next about that. But for the purpose of what I'm talking about here, when we talk about rhetoric, we often get into a mental debate about who's right. And the goal is to win the debate with facts and logic. How many lives here were saved? How many lives there were lost? And those are important facts. But what I noticed happened, and this happened in the exchange between me and Uncle Jimmy, was that there wasn't, our hearts weren't in the conversation. It was a completely mental exercise to justify something that is deeply wounding and deeply emotional, such as the atomic bombs. So I want to share here this rhetoric and the history behind, a little history behind it with Uncle Jimmy, and how I pressed him as someone from the younger generation to go deeper, to go further in examining that rhetoric and whether it tells the whole story.
Is with the education committee and team here, I go to all these schools and we talk to school kids, and every single one of them, I tell them these stories. And you know, these kids from Hiroshima, first thing they come by and say, why do you want to talk about war? You know, why don't you talk peace? I said, yeah, I'm just telling you a little bit of history, what actually happened. I'm not telling you anything. It's just that you're here to visit. I'm telling you actually what happened, what I saw. Whether it's right, wrong, or indifferent, this is what I saw. And that's what I'm trying to show you or tell you. You know, and so, but you know, we don't like war. I said, I know. And then they start coming out with, do you think the atomic bomb was right? You know, you think it's wrong to use it? You know, those kind of stuff are there. Oh, I'm shocked. You know, it kind of hit me by surprise, but I got to give my answers. You know, I went to the area where they loaded the bomb, you know, the bomb pit. Although there was no bomb, I could see the bomb, you know, in my mind. You know, fat man and little boy. You know, seeing that laying there and going over to Hiroshima to see what it's like, and Nagasaki. Those are very touching, you know. but it happened. And in a way, again, I said it happened, but it ended the war.
So here is where he says it ends the war, and it kind of stops the conversation and it stops the empathy. And so Uncle Jimmy's not the first person of his generation to repeat this rhetoric. The atomic bombs ended the war. It was told to people all the time to justify it. And again, I'll leave it up to Brien to talk about that a little bit more. But I didn't stop there because I was more interested in that moment in why the empathy shut off. Empathy happens in the heart. It doesn't happen in the brain. It happens in the heart. And in that moment, the empathy shut off. And I challenged him. And this is what I really appreciate about Uncle Jimmy is he answered the challenge. He could have looked at me like some punk kid who never knew what it was like to survive a war, didn't know what it was like to be there, and could have just disregarded me as someone who didn't understand the stakes at the time. But he didn't do that. He actually sat for a moment because I asked him something very specific. He was an 11-year-old kid who survived Pearl Harbor. And I asked him about a 2-year-old kid who survived Hiroshima's atomic bomb. Her name is Sadako. Sadako is a very famous person in Japan, and we in the United States are still learning about her. Who is she? Well, Sadako was a hibakusha, which means atomic bomb survivor from Hiroshima. She was 2 years old at the time. She survived the bomb with her brother, Masahiro Sasaki, who's in the film, and we'll see a little bit from him later. And she was diagnosed with leukemia because of the radiation from the atomic bomb. Imagine that you survived the bomb as a little kid and you think you're out of the woods, but you're not. There's a kind of ticking clock inside of you because of the radiation exposure. And so this is why it is such a well-known story in Japan. Her father told her, according to her brother, Masahiro, that if she folds 1,000 peace cranes, that she will survive cancer. She was at the Red Cross hospital in Hiroshima. She wanted to survive. She just wanted to go home and live with her family. She wanted to survive the cancer. She wound up doing the 1,000 cranes and many more. And we'll see a little bit more about that. This picture right here is the golden crane, the peace crane that was donated by Masahiro Sasaki to the Pearl Harbor Visitor Center Museum. And it remains there today. And we'll show you a little clip about how that happened. And then also how Uncle Jimmy shows us that surrendering our rhetoric, meaning stopping ourselves from trying to win the mental debate, trying to win the argument and coming back to our hearts, brings us a surprising moment of healing and empathy. So here's the history of Sadako's peace crane and then the clip with Uncle Jimmy.
When Masahiro and his son decided that they would like to donate one of Sadako's final cranes to significant historical places throughout the world. They donated one to the 9/11 Museum. They donated one to the Holocaust Museum. And they decided that they also wanted to donate one to Pearl Harbor. So this is Sadako Sasaki. The actual fact is that she exceeded folding 1,000 cranes. She actually folded about 1,300. However, the message that we would like to relay to all of the people in the world is that because of her suffering and her story, we are able to learn how important it is for us to maintain world peace and how even two countries who can be bitter enemies can eventually become the best of friends. President Truman's grandson was the one who accepted Sadako's, one of her final claims here at Pearl Harbor. And if you take a look here, you will be able to see one of the final claims that Sadako had folded.
2013年、貞子の遺品の折り鶴をこのアリゾナビジターセンターに寄贈できましたことを、今や折り鶴は平和の象徴として世界中に広がり、貞子はみんなの心の中にいます。そして原爆の少女の遺品を受け入れてくださった皆様の寛大なる心に心からの感謝を申し上げます。As I mentioned, about Sadako, for example, and when they showed me her statue, it meant nothing to me. It was just a statue, a story of a little girl. It didn't really strike me. But until it happened when the brother came by and came with the little origami, the little golden bird that she folded, and the story behind it, that was really touching. That's when you just feel sorry for an innocent little kid, dying because of radiation. And of course, she didn't want to die because she made all those birds and hoping a miracle would happen. So I'm sorry it happened.
So it's really important to see the beautiful heart that Uncle Jimmy had, but his courage, because this piece of the interview happened right after he said, but it ended the war. The atomic bombs ended the war. And I pressed him on this. And I said, what about Sadako? And again, Sadako was just a name to him until he actually met her brother, Masahiro, who was one of the featured elders at the Pearl Harbor meeting. When he met Masahiro at Pearl Harbor, it became real for him. It became a real person for him. And instead of coming back to the rhetoric and trying to justify the atomic bombs, instead, he expressed his empathy and remorse. He apologized. He said, I'm so sorry that this happened for Sadako, because he realized that this was a child. There were many civilians that died in the atomic bomb. So instead of trying to win the argument, he took the more courageous path, the path of the heart. He chose to be a human being first and a debater second. And he had empathy for Sadako. These are the kinds of breakthrough moments that we need to have in peace building. This is what we need to look for in order to be able to break through and find forgiveness. And so right here, as you can see, there's blocks to empathy, and one of them is holding on to our rhetoric without challenging it. And Uncle Jimmy taught me that surrendering our rhetoric leads to true listening, and that true listening leads to empathy, a heart-centered connection with your fellow human being. That's how you find forgiveness. That's how you move on from the past. And that's how we form true teams to tackle global warming and global conflicts. So in closing, I would just like to say, I believe the biggest paradigm shift that we could make in the world of peace building and mediation is to bring our hearts back into the discussion. We need to surrender the will to win an argument about our past choices and to bring our hearts back, to bring our capacity for empathy, hope, forgiveness, and trust back to the conversations. Because as you can see here, there are 4 elders. They survived the atomic bomb. They survived the attack on Pearl Harbor. And at the end of the meeting, they were hugging each other in forgiveness. What's stopping us? Thank you. I would just like to take a moment to pass the baton over to our director of the Matsunaga Institute for Peace, a Vietnam veteran, and one of the premier scholars, I believe, on the subject of the atomic bomb. His name is Brien Hallett, and let's give him a nice round of applause, virtually speaking.
Well, the slogan that the atomic bomb was going to end the war really grew from 1939, when the decision was made to start the Manhattan Engineering Project. So the question is, how do you justify a $2 billion project with a wildly experimental technology, right? And the possibility of success was not zero, but it wasn't, it wasn't much above zero in 1939. So you've got to have a pretty strong argument. And one of the strongest, well, there were two strong arguments. The first argument was that if the Nazis get it before us, it'll be, it'll just be awful. So we're in a race with the Nazi nuclear scientists. And of course, in 1939, the world's best nuclear scientists were in Germany. But the second reason was, once we've got this fantastic bomb, it'll end the war. Well, that certainly justifies $2 billion, right? So, the project went forward, and it was built on the assumption that the bomb would end the war. Well, of course, it's a false assumption. There's a recent book by Ward Wilson, 5 Myths about Nuclear War, 2013, in which he points out that, it wasn't the atomic bombing that forced the Japanese to surrender. It was the Japanese. It was the Soviet entry into the Pacific War. So Hiroshima was 6 August. 10 August was Nagasaki. 8 August was Stalin's declaration of war against Japan. And for the leadership in Tokyo, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been wiped out was really not a political issue. By August of 1945, 66 excuse me, I've got a bad cold. By August 1945, 66 Japanese cities had been wiped out. As a matter of fact, the effects of the atomic bombing in Hiroshima were half of the effects of the March 9th and 10th firebombing of Tokyo. So the firebombing destroyed 15 square miles of Tokyo. In Hiroshima, it was 7.5 miles were destroyed, and the casualties were approximately the same. So, there's no reason to think that the atomic bombings actually did force the Japanese. What forced them to repeat is that Stalin entered the Pacific War. And the reason that Stalin's entry forced the Japanese to surrender was that before the 8th of December, the Japanese, excuse me, had a policy. The policy was to build the defenses in Japan for the American invasion that was coming. I mean, that was no secret, right? And on the diplomatic side, to ask for Stalin, oh, excuse me, this is not going well. On the diplomatic side, the Japanese strategy was to ask Stalin to intervene with Roosevelt to propose a conditional surrender to the Japanese. Well, when Stalin declared war, the diplomatic strategy was destroyed, and the military strategy never made any sense to begin with. So the Japanese, did what they had to do. They surrendered. The other fact that I think is telling, okay, let's say that the atomic bombing ended the war and saved lives. Well, gee whiz, if it saved lives, that's sort of impressive, right? So how many lives did it save? In 1947, Secretary of War Stimson wrote a very important article in Harper's Magazine in which he said that 1 million American casualties were saved by the atomic bombing. So that means about 200,000 American deaths and 1 million casualties. In the early 1950s, Churchill said that there were 500,000 American deaths were saved. Truman agreed with Churchill and said 500,000 American deaths. Well, saving the lives of 500,000 Americans is, that's a big number, right? Well, when the archives were opened up, the Truman administration had asked MacArthur to estimate how many casualties the Americans would incur in invading Japan. And MacArthur came back and said, well, there's absolutely no way to predict that kind of thing. But our best guess is that there will be 15,000 American casualties, 7,000 American deaths for the invasion of Kyushu. And if there's a second invasion of the Kanto Plain, it'll be another 15,000 casualties, another 7,000 deaths. So the estimates that the administration working with was at max 30,000 casualties, not 500, not 1 million. The other thing you have to note is that 295 Americans were killed in all of World War II, right? So if 500,000 American lives were saved by the atomic bombing, 500,000 is almost twice as many as all the American casualties in World War II. And I don't think anybody's going to argue that the Germans were pushovers, right? So if you do the statistical analysis, it just doesn't work out. Now, Hunter talked about empathy. And he talked about how Everett, even during the attack, he didn't blame the Zero pilots that were driving. He was a sailor. They were a sailor. He'd been ordered to defend the Pennsylvania, and he followed his orders. The Zero pilots had been ordered to bomb the Pennsylvania, and they were following their orders. On both sides, everybody was doing their job. Now we can have a long discussion which side, there was more right in doing the job, which side there was less. But the fact is, everybody's doing their own job. And so Everett began from the point of view where he thought of the situation he was in terms of both sides. Another word for empathy, I think, is a non-self-regarding point of view. So Everett had a point of view, but his point of view wasn't limited to Everett. It expanded to include the Zero pilots. And if you start, if your beginning point is a non-self-regarding point of view, it's much, much easier, first of all, to understand what's really happening. And secondly, to not get caught in a trap of anger and hate and so on and so forth. And if you start with this non-self-regarding, non-selfish point of view, is what that allows you to do is to see more clearly the reality of the situation. And the reality situation is that you've got the Japanese over here at Pearl Harbor and the Americans over here, and they're both doing their jobs. So, why would you be angry? Now, if you take a self-regarding point of view, then everything the Japanese do is a personal attack on you, and that destroys empathy. I mean, if your interpretation of the situation is that everything is being directed against me personally by some other, well, you probably should be angry. But that's a false point of view. That's a false point of view. And that false point of view makes it impossible for you to see the reality of the situation. Because you're coming in, the evidence is being presented to you, and you're interpreting the evidence through your own filter, your own lens. So there's a confirmation bias going on here. Everything that disagrees with my opinion, my self-regarding opinion, you just filter it out. So I must be, what I believe must be true. So how do you open up to allow that other perspective, to somehow infiltrate in to your world, and make you realize that your self-regarding interpretation of the evidence is self-regarding. It's not an accurate interpretation of the situation that's going on. And if you start with a self-regarding point of view, then some point later in time, you have to have an encounter like Uncle Jimmy had, right? That oh, gee whiz. What I thought was reality was only half of reality. And it introduces the other half. And, once you get the other half introduced, forgiveness becomes really pretty easy, The other way I would frame the same point is that people who are insufficiently skeptical live in a fantasy world of their own making. If you don't have enough skepticism to realize that the evidence that you have may not be accurate, you're never going to forgive. So you either have to begin the process with an other regarding point of view, with a non-self-regarding point of view, which makes forgiveness relatively easy. Or at some later point in time, you have to have another experience which opens up what really happened to you, and you can, through skepticism and reevaluating, you can come to the empathetic point of view that actually captures the situation. Unless anybody has any questions, I think I'm finished.
Brien, I just wanted to thank you very much for contributing such an important interview in Sakura and Pearls. And thank you for being a rare voice out there that's willing to challenge the rhetoric and make space for meaningful discourse.
Thank you.
And thank you for being a trooper. I know you had a bad cough today, but you stuck it out, and I really appreciate that.
Yep. Mission accomplishment.
So if anyone else has any further questions, we can, either one of us would be happy to respond. Back to you, Jose.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for everything today. I just, one question that I have, just because it's been a consistent question on my mind, has been around self-care. As yourself, as a director, in the process of editing and everything that you've gone through, what have you done to kind of take care of yourself? And then simultaneously, Brien, I mean, not only professor, going through a pandemic, being a veteran, like what do you do to care for yourself? And I know you're currently getting over a cold as itself. So yeah, I just love some insights into, like, we talk about inner peace a lot. And I found that this documentary really kind of resonated with me. It's like, you know, part of that self-care sometimes is having those dialogues. It's so important. The reflection piece. But yeah, I just an open question to both of you about self-care, if you don't mind.
Well, I'm an academic, so you know that makes me outside the norm, right? So I mean, the self-care is to be skeptical and search for the truth. You know, you know, McKenna says tomato and I say tomato. Well, we got a conflict. So it's what we have to do, or at least what I have to do, is you know, do some serious research and figure out, gee whiz, how is that red thing really pronounced? Right. Now that's actually a poor example, but the point is I mean, everybody tells you that, you know, the bomb ended the war and saved lives. You know, that's just total nonsense. It's total nonsense. So you're skeptical and you don't give up until you figure it out. You know, the bomb ended the war and saved lives. I don't know. I don't imagine anybody here has been bombed before, and I've never been bombed seriously. 60 mortars and 82 mortars. But the thing about an explosion.
What? There's no such thing as casual bombing, Brien. What is going on here? What did you endure?
Well, you know, we got shelled a couple of times, but it was small stuff.
Oh my God.
You know, but the you know, but the point is that explosions dissipate with the cube of the time of the distance. So the force of the explosion is very powerful at the point of explosion, right? But as the distance goes out, the force of the explosion, you know, quickly diminishes to essentially nothing, right? So as what that means is that if you're not caught in the immediate area of the explosion, you're okay. You're okay. Furthermore, explosions, you know, take hundredths of a second to roll out, right? I mean, they don't last very long. So if the explosion does not actually destroy the target or actually destroy you, you know, wait a minute, you know, and it's over. The trains ran through Hiroshima the next day, right? the atomic bombing did not destroy the railroad tracks, did not destroy the trolley tracks. They're embedded in the earth. They're made of iron, very strong. So that in terms of the war effort, yeah, a lot of civilians were killed, but in terms of the war effort, nothing much happened. Life goes on. If you want to have permanent effects, you have to do permanent things, right? And explosions are not permanent, yeah, and you just dig down until you find out what's actually happening in the situation. And of course, that means multidimensional, right? And you have to you have to start with the point of view, well, gee whiz, there are other people involved in this, and we better check in with them.
Yeah.
And if you start with that point of view, first of all, you come to believe that tomato is the correct pronunciation, right? And this other guy just doesn't know how to speak English. Forgiveness just sort of falls out of that. I mean, the anger and the hatred, I would argue, is because of a false consciousness. You don't understand the situation. You don't understand what happened. You understand what happened to you, right? You understand what you have been told by authorities who are not, but by authorities who have a conflict of interest in this matter, right? What we've been talking about as rhetoric here all the time. But yeah, I mean, that's the way I do self-care, hard work to find out what's actually happened.
So there is a question here by Ann Smith, Chasek. She's saying, this is fascinating. I'm thinking that it must be hard for the child survivor in conflict who basically live with the struggle all their lives. Developing empathy as Jimmy did must be challenging. I've actually had a remarkable experience with many of the child survivors. I actually find them to be more empathic than the average individual because they've had such a challenging emotional experience early on in life. And it's true that they often live with it their whole lives, although it does change from time to time. Coco Kondo-san is one of the other atomic bomb survivors that's featured in the movie, and she has a remarkable transformation. In general, I find that being wounded during a young time in a life actually makes them more relatable to other people because they've been through so much, versus having become like a hardened adult and then facing these things. It's different as a child. They tend to be more empathic. That's just my personal experience. Jimmy Lee, Coco Kondo-san, Masahiro-san, they tend to fit that. Well, thank you. I deeply appreciate everyone coming out for this. We will have it on YouTube, and I'll turn it over to Jose to wrap us up.
Thank you, G.K. Hunter. I actually agree with your comments. I actually also had the wonderful opportunity to meet Coco Kondo-san, and yeah, just from a brief conversation, just really touched upon just the humanity of it, and just, I mean, just everyday kind of person. And she just shared about how she was looking forward to getting back to Japan because there was a newsletter she needed to finish up. that needed to go out because she's like, yeah, my husband doesn't really quite get the technology aspect of it. So I have to handle the newsletter for the church. And yeah, just like, it was great to just talk story. And so that was really wonderful. But thank you so much for just everything today as far as allowing us to learn about your lives and just the process of this documentary and the impact and empathy and healing in general, and just that it's an ongoing struggle. And definitely, Brien, thank you so much for being here with us as well. And just, I love the whole keep searching for the truth, keep searching for the truth. Don't just rely on what's offered to you, because so much nowadays is so that easy access, whether we go online or we go on social media, it's like, oh, I read it here, so there you go, that's the fact. And so trying to truly get to the honest truth of something is so crucial as we move forward, not only in our lives, but as we continue to try to build community and then we try to continue to uplift voices. Yes. Is that a peace sign, or you got a couple words, Brien?
No, satyagraha was Gandhi's term, insisting on the truth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you insist upon it, there's a good chance you'll find it, right? And you'll be a better person for it.
Most definitely, most definitely. And there's truly a remarkable transformative experience. And I think that's part of what the documentary kind of gets at. And thank you for the honor to be in the room as you even recorded that final meeting of the survivors. It was an honor, it was a treat. And I agree, like, come on, like, it is the opportunity to have been in that room is so much better than like any celebrity sighting I could ever, hope for. Because this is something that I could truly carry on and share with my own future generations. So thank you so much for everything today, for your kindness and leadership in the field as we explore the journey into the profession. And last but not least, thank you for joining us today's webinar. Deeply appreciate everyone that's here today in the audience, virtually, wherever you may be, to learn about exploring journey into the profession for careers in Peacebuilding Talk Story series. So thank you again, everybody. Thank you again.
Mahalo to all our veterans.
Yes.
Mahalo.
Happy Veterans Day, all.